2001.
Okay, well, remember that you're watching this first program at home, and if you are, you can send questions via SMS by simply texting your name, suburb and question to the number on your screen, 197 55222, 197 55222. Our next question actually comes from within the audience, and it's from Dara Reid.
When's the ad break, by the way?
It's not Rove now.
Prime Minister, do you intend to repeal any of the legislation introduced by the Howard government in relation to the Northern Territory intervention? And it's a double-barreled question.
I'm waiting for part two.
Do you have a national plan to address child sexual assault in Aboriginal communities and the broader Australian community?
On the intervention, I think the first thing to say is if you read the report, Little Children Are Sacred, which was produced last year, from memory, early part of last year. I may have the exact date wrong. You cannot go through its pages without reaching a conclusion that something new by way of policy has to be done because of what is occurring. Secondly, the intervention is something, as you know, we supported in the Parliament, and no, I think you need to hear this out, because the alternative is simply to turn a blind eye to abuse where it occurs, and I do not, as Prime Minister of Australia, intend to do that. It is irresponsible to do that. Does this? Well, I think on the question of the intervention, what we've also said by way of policy, and said this prior to the election, was that at the 12-month point, we will examine its effectiveness or otherwise.
You've already brought out new store cards.
And reach conclusions.
You've already brought new store cards out. So we know what's going to happen for the next 12 months.
And reach conclusions on whether it's appropriate for the future and whether it's appropriate for wider application. Can I say that there are three exceptions to the policy implemented by the previous government? One is we took a completely different position on permits. Because when it comes to permits, permits on the advice of the Northern Territory Police are in fact a much more effective means of dealing with some of the challenges of abuse in these communities than those who would suggest their complete withdrawal. So we have a different view from the government on that, and that's been well publicised. In terms of other changes, we've also said that when it comes to the reform of CDEP, that in fact that should be reformed rather than withdrawn. And on top of that, we also said that the government's previous decision to effectively suspend the application of the Racial Discrimination Act was wrong, and we have introduced appropriate amendments to deal with that. Or else we'll be introducing such amendments. I'm not quite sure where that stands in the current legislative program. So they are the three reservations that we've had. We've been very clear about that. We've said that we will review the impact of the intervention at the 12-month point. We're not at that point yet. But beyond that, this government, having been in office for 5 months, has also committed an additional $700 million plus towards what is a central program for us, is closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia. The apology to Indigenous people was simply one step along the way, closing the gap in terms of life opportunities and experience for young people and the entire Aboriginal community. That is the big challenge ahead. And that's where we've committed significant new resources.
All right, I'm going to keep this discussion going for a while. Just hang on for a moment. We do have another question from the audience along these lines, and it's from Mirinda Donnelly.
So, I'd like to know what motivated your decision to exclude...
Down here.
Ah, good. Now I can see you.
I'd like to know what motivated your decision to exclude Mal Brough from the War Cabinet that came about after the apology. And what sort of policy are we going to see right now, not in 2020 when closing the gap is going to happen? What are we seeing right now, today?
Well, what I said after the apology was that I would like a joint policy commission on Indigenous housing. And I suggested to the opposition that Mr Nelson and myself be the joint commissioners, and we put together a team of experts who actually have a lot of experience in Indigenous housing. Mr Nelson, by contrast, wanted to have other politicians involved. I didn't think that was the right way to go. I wanted experts who actually do the stuff when it comes to Aboriginal housing. And that's why we've moved in a different direction and today confirmed that we'll be having a National Policy Commission instead. On the practicalities of closing the gap, let me just give you one or two quite specific things. We have already committed funding within our first 5 months for an additional 200 teachers for remote Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, something not contained, I've got to say, within the intervention. Secondly, we've provided funding also for the construction now of 3 purpose-built boarding schools in the Northern Territory for kids who want and whose parents want them to study there from some of those communities. This commitment of funds has already occurred. This, together with many, many other quite specific programs, including those on child and maternal health, have already been committed, and Jenny Macklin, the Minister, has been on the ground active in each of these areas, way beyond the question of the intervention.
Brendan Nelson, you may be aware, has already said today that you rejected Mal Brough because of your deep ideological opposition to the Northern Territory intervention.
Well, the whole question, well, you heard my response to the question of the intervention before, and we'll review that when we get to the 12-month point. We're not there yet. But secondly, you either want to do something about Indigenous housing or you want to play politics about it. I'm not interested in playing politics about it. I want to actually do something and make a difference. And therefore, the best way of doing that is to get a bunch of people around a table who know something about Indigenous housing. And I think, and Indigenous people, including that includes people from the Indigenous, from Indigenous Australia as well. For example, Warren Mundine and others have been...
People from the Northern Territory that are actually impacted under the intervention, not do-gooders that are sitting on the coastline that say yes to you when you want them to say yes. We want real people from real communities. Anyway,
the whole body has designed to be put together, including people who have expertise in Indigenous housing and in Indigenous communities. We wanted people who can make a difference. As I said, I want experts, people who know what they're doing. I don't want a bunch of politicians.
Prime Minister, just very briefly, just to finish off that subject on Mal Brough, I mean, you rejected him simply because he's a former politician, is that right? So no chance that you'd even consider keeping him just to keep this war cabinet idea alive?
I think the position I put on the Joint Policy Commission on Indigenous housing was very practical. Here is one area where we can achieve practical results in an area which has been identified in many reports as being fundamental to making a difference on violence, making a difference on opportunities for women, making opportunities for kids. Therefore, if you want to do that, I'd simply go back to what I've said now 2 or 3 occasions, is you want people who have expertise in this, that is housing, to get some practical projects done soon, rather than to become a vehicle for a much broader political debate.
All right. We've got an SMS question, and we should take one because there are people outside this studio who are watching. This is from Stuart Miller from Narwee in New South Wales. If Australia must work smarter to survive, why did your government cut CSIRO funding?
Well, if you look at the totality of the CSIRO's budget, in fact, I think year on year it's actually gone up somewhat, but I don't have the exact figures in front of me, probably by $5 or $10 million. Then the way in which the CSIRO operates is that they will look at their forward budget for the period ahead, and they then make adjustments in terms of whether they can sustain all their programs within that budget envelope or not. And they make their own decisions. And they have made decisions to cut back in various research projects. We've provided, for example, a further $25 million for them to look at various other clean energy options. So it's a more complex proposition than has just been put. But CSIRO would have wanted a more substantial budget increase than they got. That is the absolute truth. I understand that.
Are they going to get one next time?
Well, I was about to say, if you look at the innovation review, which the Minister Kim Carr currently has underway, it will reach its conclusions by about year's end. And again, I go back to turning around the Queen Mary in 5 months. It's actually hard. You need to actually have a close and hard look at everything. For example, at CSIRO, which has a budget of $600 to $700 million a year. Is it right? Is it being properly spent? Are the priorities correct? We need to spend some time looking at that. That's why the innovation review has been commissioned. Once it reaches its findings, then you'll find that both it and other major, for example, research arms of government, for example,